Hi, welcome back to our online children's church program. We have been going through the life of Gideon. And you'll recall up to this point, we'll quickly review some of what we've talked about with the life of Gideon. Gideon had a pretty amazing life. He did a pretty amazing thing, put a lot of faith into what God had told him to do. And with it, had a lot of doubt. But God used Gideon to do something amazing. And we're going to start talking about that now. So it started out where the Israelites were continuing on with their little cycle. They had followed God, they had worshipped God, and then they started following an idol, and then they really started following an idol. And then God sent in an army. In this case, it was the Midianites and the Amalekites. And this army captured Israel, forced Israel tribute, made Israel miserable. And then Israel would cry out to God, and that's where we come in now. Is Israel was crying out to God for a deliverer. And in the past, what God had done is he had sent a judge. He had sent someone, he had made them judge, and they became the leaders of Israel. Israel had no kings at this point. Up to this point, there was no king in Israel. They were ruled only by God. And it's hard to listen to your ruler when you're worshiping another God. Right? It's hard to follow God. It's impossible to follow God when you're worshiping another. So, Israelites had cried out to God, and God had a plan. He was going to deal with the Midianites and the Amalekites. And he was going to send Gideon. Now, Gideon, when we first meet him, is hiding in a winepress. He's sitting in a hole in the ground, and he's threshing wheat. So he's tossing wheat up in the air, trying to let the, it's called chaff, blow away, all the remnants from the outside of the wheat, so he could get the little grain out of it. Right? He's hiding. He's hidden from the Midianites just in case they come by so they don't see him. And an angel of the Lord appears before him and says, "The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." God's going to be with you, you brave, strong man. And Gideon, he's a little lippy. He says, if God's really with me, why am I hiding from the Midianites? Why are the Midianites here? No, God is not with Israel. God tells him, you're going to free Israel. And Gideon says, if this is all true, if this is really you speaking to me, God, let me get your angel, let me get you a meal. Let me go prepare you some food. Angel says, go ahead. So Gideon runs off, he prepares some food, he brings it back. Angel says, go ahead and put it all on that rock right there. And pour out the broth on top. So Gideon sets it all out, he obeys. And the angel takes his staff, he touches the rock, and fire comes from the rock. Consumes the whole thing. From there, now we're just kind of flashing through because there's a lot to tell. And if you want to go deeper into this, it's in Judges, chapters 7 and 8. Actually, I think it's 6, 7, and 8. But in the book of Judges is where you'll find this. You can also go back through and you can look at the videos. They're all on YouTube. Cornerstone Baptist Kids on YouTube. But God gives Gideon command, says, go tear down the idol of Baal, cut down the grove around, and sacrifice a young bull from your father's flock, or from your father's herd, on an altar you make for me. So Gideon grabs 10 servants, and at night he goes out and he does this. Because he's still afraid. He's afraid of the people around him. Next morning, they come over. They're furious when they see their altar is torn down and their grove is cut. And they go, and they find out it was Gideon. And they go to Joash, who was Gideon's father. They said, bring him out. We're going to kill him. And Joash tells them, if Baal is angry at this, let Baal deal with him. Let Baal deal with Gideon. Gideon, on all of this, gets filled with God, and he knows he's got to do something. So he steps up, he grabs a horn, and he blasts it, and he sends out messengers, and he starts gathering up the army. In the meantime, the Midianites and the Amalekites have gathered together, and they've crossed the river, and they are numbered like the sand of the sea. There are so many of them, they can't be counted. Now Gideon is seeing all of this, and he's getting a little nervous. He says, God, if this really is what you want for me, I get a test. I'm going to ask you to do this. If it really is what you want, I'm going to lay out a thing of fleece, a little rug of fleece. And I want you, when I wake up, I want the fleece to be wet, but the ground to be dry. Make the fleece wet, but the ground dry. Gideon wakes up the next morning, and of course, God does want Gideon doing this. God does have this plan for Gideon. He is going to use him. So God does what Gideon has asked. And Gideon's able to wring a bowl full of water out of that rug, out of that fleece. That's not enough for Gideon. He's like, it could be a fluke. It could be a mistake. So I'm going to lay it out again, oh God. This time, make the ground wet and the fleece dry. Don't be angry with me. This time, make the ground wet and the fleece dry. We serve such a patient God. How often do we do things like that? Maybe we don't lay out fleece and look for it, but how often do we ask God, oh God, give us a sign. Is this really what you want? Instead of truly trusting him, right? But this is what Gideon has done, and God is a patient God. And next morning, Gideon gets up, and there, the fleece is dry, but the ground is soaked with dew. Now Gideon should know that this is what God wants. In the meantime, 32,000 men of Israel have gathered together, and he has pitched his tent in Harod, which is on the north side of the army, or the south side. The army of the Midianites are to the north of him. 32,000 people have come. Now they're facing the Midianites, and there's more than 120,000 of them. They can't be numbered. There's so many, but there is a lot of them. God looks at Gideon's army and says, your army's too big. If you win, they're going to say, look what I have done. And they're not going to give God any praise for what God did. They're not going to be looking to say, look what God did. They're going to be saying, by my hand, by my strength, I helped free Israel. It's by God's hand that Israel was freed. So God says, there's too many of them. You're going to ask how many of them are afraid, and those you're going to send home. So Gideon asks, are there any that are afraid and want to go home? If you are, just go. Go home. There's too many of you, go home. 22,000 men went home, leaving 10,000 people to fight over 120,000. Higher math, that means each Israelite soldier has to kill 12 people. Has to kill 12 other soldiers. It's 12 to 1. God says, that's still too many. You're going to take them down to the river, and you're going to see how they drink. And I'm going to tell you which ones to let go. Which ones to send home. So he did. And all those that stayed ready, that drank from their hand, not the ones that dunked their head in the river to get a drink, or dropped everything to get a drink. Only the ones that drank from their hand and stayed ready did God use. The rest, he said, send home. This left Gideon with an army of 300 people. 300 soldiers. That's it. Versus more than 120,000. that night was the time. That's where we start today. But first, let's go into our verse. Let's get into our Bible verse. I want you to say it with me. I thought this is phenomenal. This is a great verse. Let's put it to memory. Here we go. Isaiah 41:10a. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. That's so cool. That's so cool. He's saying, don't be afraid, because I am with you. I'm right there. Don't be discouraged. That's hard. Sometimes that's hard. He says, don't be discouraged. I am your God. We don't worship a God like Baal, who's made of wood. We don't worship gods of money, like Mammon, or just money in general, because it comes and goes. Very quickly it's there, it's great, and then it's gone. Just like that, you can go to poor very easily. Right? We don't serve those gods. We don't serve the gods like the Greeks did, that change, that are constantly different and very emotional, or just get bored. We don't serve those gods. We don't serve gods that don't listen to us. We serve one God, Jehovah. He said, I am thy God. Isn't that awesome? What do we have to be discouraged about? Why would we be discouraged? The Lord is our God. Let's say it one more time. Here we go. Isaiah 41:10a. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. Now we pick up where Gideon was. Gideon was asleep. God wakes him up. God says, arise, get up. It's time to go defeat the Midianites. But God is a patient God, and He's an understanding God. He knows that we're human. We get discouraged. We get afraid. We see that there is no way to beat things, and we don't understand. And God knows this, and He loves us and is patient and cares about all of this. And He does so with Gideon. He's shown all of these signs. He's shown Gideon time and again that he's in charge. He has spoken with Gideon and told him what to do and what's going to happen. And yet Gideon's still afraid, and he knows and understands all of this. So God says, Gideon, if you are still afraid, go down, take your servant, and go down into the camp. And there, you're going to hear something that's going to encourage you. And you'll come back and be ready to go. So Gideon takes this opportunity and he goes down. He sneaks down into the camp. And there, he's in the Midianite camp. There, he and his servant hear two soldiers talking. One of them is telling a dream. He says, I had a dream last night that a small cake of barley, small little piece of wheat, or cake of wheat, fell onto the ground, and it rolled down the hill, and it hit the side of a tent. It hit the stake of a tent, the post. And the post was knocked out, and the tent collapsed. It really freaked me out. It was a really crazy dream. And the other man, the other soldier, he says, that cake can be nothing else, no one other than Gideon, son of Joash. That cake represents Gideon, son of Joash, and the tent is the Midianites. And God has given The God of Israel has given the army of Midian into the Israelites' hand. They're afraid of Gideon. They're afraid of Gideon and that army. God's sending dreams, and that's the interpretation. And when Gideon hears this, the first thing he does is he worships God. He worships God. I wonder how often we tend to forget that. How often we forget to worship God when we've heard some amazing news. When what he said, we know what he said is going to come to pass. Did we worship him for it? Did we thank him and praise his name? Or do we forget? We get caught up in the moment and don't give credit to God. Gideon didn't forget. He praised and worshipped God right there. He ran back to the camp. You can just imagine how excited he was to run back, to realize that the army, that God has put fear into their hearts. They're afraid of them. The Midianites, the Amalekites, they are afraid of these 300 soldiers. They're afraid of Gideon. Gideon goes running back. He wakes his soldiers. And he says, "Arise! God has given you, he has put the Midianites into your hand." He says, "Get up! The victory is here. It's time. You have already won. It's time to go get the victory." You've already won. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? Gideon was encouraged. Now, Gideon should have had the faith just to believe that what God said would come to pass. He needed that sign. God had to keep reassuring him, but you know what? God loved him and kept reassuring him. He knew Gideon's weaknesses. God knows yours as well. When you're struggling, go to God. Remember, don't be afraid, because he's with us. And don't be discouraged when it doesn't go the way you were thinking. He is your God. I hope this has been an encouragement. I hope you've learned something new out of the book of Gideon, or out of the life of Gideon. This is a part that's really not mentioned a whole ton in most of the children's stories, and most of the times you go through Gideon, it's really not mentioned a whole ton, but this was big. This was big for Gideon and his confidence, and God used that to bolster him and get him really going. But I hope more than any of those things that it's given you a new notion of who our God is. He cares. He wants you to trust him and follow him. And he understands when it's a struggle. If you're having struggle with whatever it is, can I encourage you? Pray. Stop what you're doing, whatever it is, and pray. When Gideon struggled, he asked of God. I'm going to encourage you to do the same. God may not wet the ground around you and keep your fleece dry. But we serve an awesome God that will give you peace if you just ask. Go to him in prayer. remember that He is your God. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you again next week.